Restoration Conference. This year, SRF's conference theme is Taking a Pulse, Measuring Restoration Success. It seems like light years ago that the SRF board and staff came up with the theme of this year's conference. Taking the Pulse was somewhat inspired by the recurring monitoring themes in this year's agenda, ranging from coastal monitoring to fish passage high up in the Klamath Basin. While we share our restoration successes, it's impossible right now to not take stock of the federal dismantling of the very institutions that provide a scientific and regulatory framework for salmonid recovery. Our operating field has shifted, and there have been so many casualties, with threats to the Endangered Species Act, mass federal layoffs, funding freezes, cuts to AmeriCorps, NRCS community programs, Sea Grant, CAL FIRE, and so many more disruptions. I sincerely hope that the SRF conference and community can be a safe haven where participants can engage in robust discussions, learn about cutting-edge science, and talk openly about climate change as well as diversity and equity in the watershed restoration field. In these challenging times, SRF is especially grateful for our many sponsors who have made it possible to offer an unprecedented number of scholarships this year for tribal members, students, WSP, young professionals, and dare I say, federal employees. Our co-sponsors contribute ideas, time, and resources to the production of the conference, and without the many, many sponsors we had this year, it just truly would not have been possible. We are so appreciative of the field tour, workshop, and session coordinators who do an outstanding job of creating a dynamic agenda, as well as all of the dedicated presenters who are here sharing their knowledge and expertise. I especially want to acknowledge CDFW's Fisheries Restoration Grant Program for their long-term support of the conference and other technical education events. A special shout out to the Watershed Stewards Program and the CCCs, whose members provide valued service and are the next generation of restoration practitioners. I want to give a heartfelt thanks to the SRF staff and board of directors who work tirelessly to ensure that the conference runs smoothly. And mostly SRF is grateful for the wide range of conference participants who are present despite whatever obstacles you face to be here. I'd like to take a moment for each of us to think of someone who is not here and should be. This could be someone who is a stalwart colleague, a great scientist, a recovery coordinator, a program administrator, maybe someone you disagreed with, someone who helped you to see something in a different way. If you've been impacted by what's going on, or if you have someone in mind, please stand up. Literally, stand up. And I'd like us all to call out the person that came to mind right now. Andrea Berry. Yeah. Say it loud. Say it loud. All the people. So I think they are present here with us, and I think it's an extraordinarily important time to remember that we are all in this together, and we need to continue to honor the service of everyone that's contributed to this field and figure out ways to continue to work together.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 42nd Annual Salmonid Restoration Federation. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, but I did want to acknowledge what Dana said about the times that we're going through and emphasize a note of perseverance and determination. This isn't the end of anything. It is the end of an era, but it is not the end of restoration of fisheries. Nobody's giving up on the fish. We are going to continue, even without federal funding if we have to. We're going to figure out a way. I take inspiration from the tribe that I work for, which has been down before, but it's come back and will come back again. I've been talking with some of my tribal colleagues about this, and this is what they're saying, is that we've been down before, we're going to get through this, and we're going to figure out a way through this. So that's what I want to say right now. We've got the dams out, they're never going back in. We're going to continue that theme. We're going to fix everything that we can in any way that we can. So we have a diverse and amazing lineup of speakers today. We have Kellyx, we have Frankie Myers, we have Jonny Armstorng, Desiree Tullos, and Tommy Williams. I can't believe I got through all that without choking one name. Our first speaker here is, I'm going to read, she sounds amazing, Kellyx Nelson, who is a passionate about public service and building strong alliances to tackle thorny challenges. Kellyx has spent 35 years in nonprofits, government, and the private sector, developing initiatives that benefit environment and people. She's been the executive director of Resource Conservation District since 2006. Kellyx's diverse career has included 14 years as an environmental educator for underserved communities in New York and San Francisco, driving a Freightliner cross-country as a long-haul trucker, delivering packages as a motorcycle message, and managing conservation projects for a land trust. She has an undergraduate degree from Columbia University in political science and environmental science and a master's degree in public policy from UC Berkeley. Under her direction, the RCD has achieved distinction, receiving multiple awards and recognition, including NOAA's partner in the Spotlight for Recovery of Central Coast Coho Salmon. Kellyx was inducted into the San Mateo County Women's Hall of Fame for her work in the RCD and was the 2024 Bay Nature Local Hero for Conservation Action. And I'd like to welcome Kellyx Nelson.
And Joel Casagrande were my people that I named from NOAA who aren't here today. Okay. So, what does everyone in this room have in common? There are wild animals that we love that risk extinction. Some are on the very brink. We care about them, we don't want to see them go away forever, and we are called to action. Humans caused this situation, humans are obligated to fix it, and many of us in this room have committed our lives to doing that work. We are here to be effective, and we want to make a difference. We know that this is a critical time, and that we face so many barriers and challenges to getting essential work done. This is weird feedback. Does anybody know what to do about that? Put it right at my face? That's counterintuitive. Like this? Ooh, isn't that a bit much? No? Okay, so we know that this is a critical time and that we face so many barriers and challenges to getting essential work done. So here's my question. Are we addressing the opportunities and the barriers within ourselves? We're pretty clear on what the threats to salmonids are, and we've developed hundreds of strategies laid out in species recovery plans and watershed plans and other documents, countless goals and objectives and actions, assessments and designs and contracts, MOUs, agreements, requests for bids, proposals, monitoring protocols, monitoring plans, monitoring reports, research and publications, restoration projects, large and small with heavy equipment or hand crews, outreach and education. One of the things that all of these activities has in common is that they involve humans, us. And then we encounter time and time again that many of the biggest barriers and biggest opportunities that we face in doing this work is our very humanity. We consider our human experience, our needs and our feelings, ancillary at best and unprofessional at worst. But whether we want to acknowledge them or not, they're here, and they're here to stay. So what do I mean by that? Have you ever not tried something because it might fail? Have you ever scaled back or designed a restoration project to accommodate a landowner's concerns that had nothing to do with fish? Have you ever done more costly and time-consuming environmental reports than were required to help a community member or your organization's leadership or your attorney feel comfortable with a restoration approach? Have you ever appeased a donor with work that you knew detracted from bigger priorities? Have you ever not known how to proceed, felt like a deer in the headlights because you were intimidated by a potential lawsuit or public records request or contracting law or prevailing wage compliance or threat of an audit or the myriad things that your degree in engineering or biology or geomorphology did not prepare you for? Have you ever become so jaded that you find yourself going straight to what is probably feasible without even considering something more aspirational? And on the flip side, have you ever had such a trusted relationship with a partner that you advanced their goals when it did not benefit you, knowing that reciprocity is complex and will come around later somehow? Have you ever felt so empowered and supported by your organization's leadership that you were able to innovate a new approach that advanced our field of practice in a small way or in a big way? Have you ever known a landowner who was willing to do a restoration project on their property because they trusted you or someone else, not because of models or hydrographs or designs, but because of a relationship? Have you ever felt discouraged or hopeless or depleted, but then a colleague reminded you how wonderful you are and inspired you to keep going in this work? And have you ever failed, and as scary as it was, found that it wasn't the end of the world and something good came of it? So, here's one of my many fails. Apinolio Creek in San Mateo County. We removed a perched culvert that was a barrier to fish passage and rebuilt the gradient with step pools, and installed a preformed concrete bridge which we had shipped down from Chico and brought way back up this canyon with a crane. The project had a long history of delays. I was brand new, I was clueless, I was scared, all eyes were on me, and the bridge did not cross the creek. Yes, I built the bridge to nowhere, and if it's hard to see in this picture, this was really artful photo monitoring. So I was terrified, and I called everybody, stakeholders, funders, regulators, the engineer and contractor, and I asked them to share ownership of the problem and the solution and just support me. I asked them to help me, and long story short, everyone did. The engineer and the contractor did pro bono work, materials were donated, funders and regulators exercised tremendous flexibility, and it was an inflection point in the reputation of San Mateo RCD to overcome challenges, as well as my reputation as a problem solver. The bridge to nowhere was a powerful early lesson to me about partnership and making lemonade. And honestly, ultimately, what was at stake? We had to spend more resources to fix something after this, and I was afraid what people would think of me. That's it. Even without any actual failures or consequences, so much of our work is driven by managing potential risk. Too often we lead with what might go wrong because we're scared, rather than what we want to go right. And what might go wrong, of course, is an essential consideration in our designs, but it should be a passenger, not the driver. And so let's talk about risk for a minute. There might be no fish left for us to recover if it weren't for environmental laws and regulations that are particularly effective at stopping bad actions like building condos on wetlands. But what about when the damage has already been done and the action is environmental restoration? Our regulatory framework provides very few mechanisms for considering the risk of the status quo. Climate change, habitat degradation, and a biodiversity crisis. While taking action might pose a risk, in some cases not taking action or acting too slowly might pose a graver threat. As our Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, has said, winning slowly on climate change is losing. And yet here we are, strongly oriented towards thinking of action as a risk rather than a mandate. We know that restoration must be done faster and at a much larger scale. We know we are losing ground, yet when we say we need to be aggressive, work faster, work at a larger scale, don't you feel some resistance bubbling up? Don't you just kind of feel a little bit of concern? Is the answer to that concern that we should restore California's streams and rivers 500 linear feet at a time? A few wood structures at a time, one grant at a time? Of course not. We know that. So I'm going to say it again. We need to do aggressive, innovative, large-scale restoration quickly, right now, no delays. It feels a little scary, right? When you say that, like, isn't there a part of you that's like, well, but we do have to be careful, let's not move too fast, we don't want to do any harm. So recognizing that conflict within ourselves and recognizing the risks of both action and inaction, many of us have begun developing permitting pathways for restoration that ensure thoughtful project design while also recognizing that the risk of a well-designed restoration project is generally lower than the risk of the status quo in areas where habitat is already degraded. I've had the opportunity to work closely with the Cutting the Green Tape initiative, California's initiative to reduce regulatory barriers to restoration. And I've spoken with hundreds of regulators, restoration practitioners, and environmental advocates about how they perceive and experience risk. Many people recall that well-intentioned restoration project that had unintended consequences 15 years ago. And that's their guiding light. Some fear being sued, some that they will not have the protection of their leadership if they lean into innovation. Some regulators have used the term trauma. They described feeling such a weight of species extinction on their shoulders that they don't feel that they can accept any risk of anything going wrong. One told me he spent 35 years of his life trying to keep one fish from going extinct, and upon his retirement, wondered if it was all for nothing. Without exception, what they experienced was scarcity. Not enough fish, not enough time, not enough resources, not enough permission. Many of us are so immersed in our feelings of scarcity with inadequate funding, data, partners, willing landowners, or design constraints or permit constraints, that we restrict our vision right out of the gate to what we presume is feasible, and we don't allow ourselves to reach for more. Sometimes we limit our vision before we even try. Our human selves also crave certainty. We've created funding and permitting systems that largely manage for certainty by requiring known outcomes. Can you imagine going to a funder or a regulator and saying, hey, I have a concept for altering this creek. I don't know exactly what the outcome will be, and it might change from season to season, year to year, and be somewhat unrecognizable in a few years, but I can reasonably anticipate how it'll function. I mean, can you even imagine going to somebody and saying that? It sounds crazy, right? But what I'm describing is essentially process-based restoration. And for those of us in the room who are a little bit longer in the tooth, we remember that process-based restoration was a hard sell. And that even when we knew it was needed, we couldn't permit or fund it until we could wrap our heads around the outcomes and the metrics in a way that met our need for certainty. We also crave certainty in outcomes in our partnerships. A key difference between coordination and collaboration is that coordination involves aligning efforts around a known goal. You do this task, I'll do that task, while collaboration is a deeper, trust-based relationship where we hold the concerns of others as dear as our own. It is inherently vulnerable. It is a deliberate process with an emergent and unknowable outcome. And even when research overwhelmingly shows that collaboration is more effective for getting work done, especially when that work crosses organizational and jurisdictional boundaries, that collaboration accomplishes better quality work and at a larger scale and is uniquely capable of creating new solutions to thorny problems, we don't want to fund the process of collaboration. We want to fund a shovel-ready implementation project with 60% designs. And when we do work together in these partnerships or collaborations, let's not forget the very human experience of conflict. If you're really out there doing the work, you've either experienced the conflict or you've avoided it. There are no other options. Disagreements about priorities for monitoring, funding, projects, disagreements about approach, roles, jurisdictions, interpretation of law and permit requirements and species protections, contract terms, change orders, conflicts about whether to leave wood in a creek in a community that has concerns. There are theories in psychology that conflict helps actually shape our identity, develop community, and express our purpose. While some form of conflict is largely inevitable and can drag down our work, if we show up authentically and honestly and vulnerably and truthful about our needs, I believe conflict can be art. And it can be a generative space for new ideas and partnerships and solutions. And now I'm going to talk about the F word in the humanity of restoration, a word that actually doesn't begin with an F, and that is credit. Have you heard someone say, I don't care who gets the credit, I just want it to get done, but then silently seethe when others take credit for their work? Have you been this person? I have. It's like an epidemic in nonprofits and government that we expect martyrdom, especially among my sisters out there. And yet humans desire to be seen for their contributions. This work is our art, and artists sign their canvas. Can we please drop the expectations of martyrdom and give people credit for their work? Yes. And going beyond those of us who do this as our work, it is said that watershed science is a social science. What are the needs and the motivations of landowners, public and private, farmers and ranchers, public works departments, utilities, developers, landfill companies, timber companies, that will determine whether salmonids survive? What are the incentives and disincentives to inspire watershed stewards and voluntary restoration? Do we expect a farmer to prioritize stream flow over irrigating their crops? Do we expect a timber operator to forego revenue to protect habitat? Do we expect landowners and utilities and road managers to leave wood in creeks where it may harm their property and infrastructure? Do we expect tribes to forego their sovereignty to accept funding because of a boilerplate risk management clause? Or are we addressing these issues to advance restoration? Never once have I seen a project die because there was no technical solution. Yet I have seen countless projects fail or be drastically delayed or altered or reduced in scope because of lack of respect, low trust, perceptions of risk, fear of failure, and conflict. And more often than not, a critical piece that was missing was empathy. Can we see that next slide? Thank you. I always have this image up in my office. It's a representation of an ancient Chinese proverb about 6 blind men who are touching an elephant. The man who's touching the tail says an elephant is a broom. The man who's touching the ear says, no, an elephant is a fan. The man who's touching the leg says an elephant is a tree. You get the picture. We're also immersed in our work that we often begin to think, the part of the work that we touch is its totality. It's the part that matters, is the part that we touch. The project manager, the grant administrator, the regulator, the contractor, the landowner, the legislator, we can all lose sight of the elephant. So here's my challenge to us today. What if we all allow vulnerability and trust into our work relationships and show up more as our true selves when we're being professional? What if we lead with vision, not with constraints, and approach our aspirations with how we can instead of why we can't? What if we embrace shared purpose and uncertain outcomes in our partnerships? What if we approach differences and conflicts with empathy or curiosity? What if we share our epic fails with each other, not just our successes? What if each of us here commits to being the wind in someone's sail at least once this week? Let them know they matter, their work matters, they're contributing. And what if we invest in someone else's career? And for those of us who are further along in our careers, how about investing in someone who is newer in their career? And what if we give ourselves permission to connect with what is holy to us in this work? Allow ourselves to shed a tear when we witness the migration of these beautiful animals. I believe this is what happens. This is the Pescadero watershed, embroiled in litigation and acrimony for decades, devastating annual fish kills with thousands of dead steelhead, fish versus farms for water, endangered species versus flood mitigation. During town hall meetings about watershed planning, the sheriff had to come, and I kid you not, tell people they could not bring weapons to watershed planning meetings. And it was like the Bermuda Triangle for collegial relationships of agency staff trying to develop a shared problem statement. One significant funder said their agency would not invest a nickel in this watershed because nothing could get done there. And elected officials, they just gave up. It was only through deep listening, showing up, difficult conversations, powerful collaboration, building trust, talking about risk, acknowledging our failures, and leading with a seemingly impossible vision that partners were able to completely change the trajectory of this watershed. The fish kills have stopped. Fish passage has been restored to an entire watershed. Stream flows have been restored and protected. Floodplain restoration, sediment management, habitat complexity, you name it, it's really working for the fish and the people. So I guess what I'm saying is that these fish need more than our monitoring, our designs, our sediment budgets, our hydrographs, and I'm sorry to say, our beaver dam analogs. They need us. Thank you.
Speaker, Frankie Myers is a personal friend of mine, former vice chair of the Yurok tribe, and so much more. Spent his childhood on the Klamath River, Tule Creek. His whole family is amazing. His father was a tribal council member that I worked with for years undamming the Klamath. I went to Scotland with your dad, actually, in our efforts to get the things out. In more recent days, Frankie has started a company. He's the principal of Fix the World Consulting, in which he is working on fixing the world. And to explain more about what I mean by that, and keeping with our theme of perseverance and restoration, Frankie Myers.
Ayukui. I am very excited to be here today and share 3 ideas, principles that I've learned over my career in the 2 decades undamming the Klamath River. The first idea or principle is that the concept of wilderness did not exist on this continent pre-contact. The second is traditional ecological knowledge is learned. And the third, and I think One of the most important is that we are a part of the ecosystems that we live in. When I was about 6 years old, my parents moved me and my 8 brothers and sisters to Oregon City, Oregon, to help take care of my ailing grandfather on my mother's front side. And he was from Frog Hop, Tennessee. It was a culture shock for me in a lot of ways. One being that the elementary school I was about ready to attend had more people than I think our entire reservation did. The other one is there was 3 kids of color in the school. There was me and my 2 brothers. The irony, I feel like, in my life is that I learned the Native American history in America like most non-natives do, like most non-natives do through our educational system. I learned of the noble savage, the hunter-gatherer living in peace and harmony with the world around them, gathering and taking only what they need, living with each other gracefully. It wasn't later in life, it wasn't until later in life that I understood that this narrative of the Native American pre-contact was actually built on the ideals of white supremacy and the foundation of the racist and systemic racism that I would fight for the vast majority of my life. What we know now and what I understand now is there was no part of this continent that was wild. There was no wilderness that existed in the Americas. That our great old-growth redwood forests were planted and cultivated. The grasslands of the Great Plains was a massive rangeland project built to develop herds of buffalo. See, range management was here on this continent before the word cowboy ever existed. And all of this information was readily available. We've known for generations that land bridge theory wasn't right and was incorrect. Hundreds of papers have been written on the management of the Northeast and the South. From the time that settlers first landed on the shores of Central America, we understood that this continent was full of complex cultures and societies. When Cortez first saw Teotihuacan, he was looking at the largest, most densely populated city in the world, with an empire over 25 million people alone, that had libraries and aqueducts and roads that would make the Romans shameful. It's important that we understand that concept. It's important that we grasp the reason why the narrative of the noble savage has to be dispelled. Because when we don't, the work of our ancestors is just diminished. For a lot of my life, I struggled on my second point. The idea that traditional ecological knowledge is learned. See, like you, I also love and share the story that the Creator gifted us this knowledge since time immemorial. gave it to us, and we have simply been practicing what we were given. But in my decades of learning from our elders, learning from my grandparents, learning from individuals who were taught in a manner and in a life before non-natives were on this continent, learning the stories of fox and raccoon and the pitfalls of interpersonal conflict, the stories of Sagab or Coyote and what happens when we succumb to jealousy and greed, and the story of Hulakla coming back to end a great starvation that pushed our people to the brink of extinction so much that our elders dug their own graves to save future generations. And all that I've learned and all the stories that I know, I couldn't find one that showed where the Ten Commandments came to us from the Creator. But what I did learn, and what I do understand, is that our myths and our stories are a collection of failures. A collection of failures over thousands of years. Hundreds of ways of how not to live here. Hundreds of ways of what goes wrong when you over-harvest your salmon. When you don't manage your conifer forest. When you can't live with your neighbors. When you can't respect one another. TEK is a handing down of our failures of how to live in this place. That we learned over generations of work. That we've learned over generations of work. Taught to each generation in a way that they can grasp and understand, a way that would resonate with them. We speak of this knowledge being handed to us from the Creator because that is a concept that we can understand today. That's an idea that resonates in the people who we're telling it to. Because for us, the Creator is all around us, all the time. My great-aunt Queen was one of those elders who grew up being taught by her grandparents that were raised in a traditional village, the traditional village system, before the vast majority of our world was turned upside down. She lived at the village of Kinnick. And Kinnick, for Yurok people, is the center of our world, is where we believe humanity first came to this world. And she told my mother a story. My mother told me this story. And she said one night, she was laying in her bed and she was awoken by Rawa, which is the spirit that lives in the river. And he woke her up and he said, I have something to show you. And when she woke up, she immediately knew who it was. She felt his presence. And so she went with him. And they went down the trail to the river and they climbed up the back of the prayer rock that overlooks Tula Creek. And he said, look. So she looked out and she could see all the way to the headwaters up by Crater Lake in Oregon. She could see all the way to the mouth of the river. And she could see into the river itself. She could see into the bedrock. And then instantly, she saw the returning runs of lamprey and sturgeon and salmon migrating in and out of the river over and over. And she was filled with joy to see such an amazing thing before her. And she welled up with tears and she said, "Thank you, Rewa. Thank you for showing me this amazing experience, to be able to witness this. Thank you." But he said, Paul, Tawaz, Wasim, look again. And so again, she looked back, and again, she could see the entirety of the Klamath Basin, and again, she could witness the runs coming in and out of the river, and again, she was filled with joy. But as she kept watching, she began to notice that the Yurok stopped coming back. And the lamprey stopped coming back, and the sturgeon and the salmon were soon gone. And before she knew it, the river was completely void of life. And then there was nothing. And she was filled with sadness, and she wept again in her heart. And she thought about her life, and she asked Rawa, "What have I done? What have I done to witness such an atrocity? To watch all the things that I love disappear, and the river that is my home die?" And he said, "I've shown you this so you can understand. You can understand if there ever comes a time when there's no more salmon in the river, there'll be no more need for people to exist on this earth. Because we are a part of our ecosystems. We've always been a part of our ecosystems. And it's humans that are the keystone species of every ecosystem. Humans are the keystone species. The world is our habitat. And it's our responsibility to bring balance and restoration to the world around us, just as it always has. And these were the principles that helped guide the Undam the Klamath campaign. They were what allowed us to see a vision larger than we had ever seen before. To look at the solution on a watershed scale, because we looked to what had happened before. Because we knew we had to learn new skills. Because we understood that TEK is learned. So we had to learn some new TEK. We had to figure out new ways to share our story so that it would resonate with the people that we needed to understand it. And we needed more people to understand that we were a part of the ecosystem around us. And that it was the humans' responsibility to restore our ecosystems. I was really, really honored and excited to be able to talk to you all and have a platform to have this discussion. Because all of us who know the true narrative of the Undam the Klamath campaign understand that it took all of us, thousands of people, working together to accomplish dam removal. And it's gonna take all of us to continue to build and learn to restore the world around us. We are living in an age of learning. What we know now, what we learn now, will be the TEK of future generations because we're failing. Because we're failing. But it doesn't end there. We keep building. We keep learning. We keep working to restore balance. We spend our lives working to restore balance. Just as every generation has done before us, because it is our responsibility. Because it's who we are. It's our role. And if you have spent your life working to restore the world around you, and I often think of this for myself when I am discouraged, when projects don't go the way I want, and I can't get people to just do the goddamn right thing. I remember, if I spend my whole life working to restore this world, I will have simply done the same thing that everyone in my family has done since the beginning of time. And I won't let the chain go unbroken. More importantly than everything I've said today, I was honored to come here and talk, to say thank you. You always don't get opportunities to stand in front of your colleagues and your peers and the people that are important to you and say thank you. To say thank you for the work and the dedication. So from the bottom of my heart, from all that I am, I say thank you. Walk. 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 Thank you.
Proud to have known Frankie for a long time. Watched him spend time in the river, did heavy equipment operating, he's done it all. And I'm really glad he shared with us today. We're going to be going from the sort of overarching picture and framework upon which we base our restoration consciousness here and start talking some more about specifics here. We have Dr. Jonny Armstorng here, who has done a lot of amazing work on Redband trout in the upper basin. And as he's going to explain to you why is that important, because it's a portent of what the salmon, how they're going to use the basin and the things that they're going to do. And I do have a bio here. I got so distracted by Frankie's great talk. So, all right, so Jonny is an associate professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. His research program integrates, hang on, my timer's going on. Thank you, Phone, I appreciate that. Let's see, his research program integrates animal behavior, physiology, and landscape ecology. He got his Ph.D. from the University of Washington and was a Smith Conservation Research Fellow at University of Wyoming before joining the faculty at OSU. In his free time, Jonny enjoys surfing, oh great room, Santa Cruz here, and spending time with his 6- and 9-year-old daughters. Please welcome Dr. Jonny Armstorng.
I might try using the Are we going to get feedback if we do this?
It seems like we got that right.
Alright. I've only held the mic when like giving toasts at weddings, so I've never done it sober, so I think I feel better. Alright. Alright, can everybody hear me okay?
No, closer.
Closer? Alright. So it's a great honor to be part of this plenary. I think y'all kind of did me dirty, making me follow up on those 2 talks. I'm a little bit nervous. So I want to start out just by this picture. I helped my friend take this picture. Jason Ching took this picture. And this is what I think is one of the most amazing fishes in the world. And this is a redband trout. And this is when this population is spawning in November at the northwest corner of Upper Klamath Lake, where the cascades just go right into the lake. And you can see those jagged rocks they're spawning in. That's like rocks from a landslide. And there's a bunch of upwelling groundwater there. And you can see it's just crystal clear. And then you get that kind of foggy, ethereal lake in the background. And those are dozens, if not hundreds, of redband trout that are about the size of a coho salmon getting ready to spawn. So what I think, this is an amazing scene. And it's now a scene that steelhead and chinook are going to potentially be able to enjoy. So I want to be talking about what can we learn from redband about what the constraints and opportunities might be for these future runs of anadromous fish. And so I think I don't have to tell you how cool the dam removals are. It's one of the greatest acts of restoration that we've ever seen, especially in the salmon world. And to me, what is particularly just thrilling about it is where those dams were located, right? It's pretty close to actually where I grew up in Ashland, Oregon. And they're right around the Cascade Crest. So at the natural division between 2 really different rivers or watersheds, the lower Klamath and the upper Klamath. So they're gonna remove this barrier and allow salmon and steelhead to cross the Cascade Crest into an area with a really distinct geologic and evolutionary history. And so while it's incredibly exciting, there's a lot of uncertainty around how fish are going to use this basin. So why would I say that the upper basin is fundamentally different? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but here's a few. And you can kind of see them in these pictures here. So first, is the fact that it is this interior basin that was historically part of the Great Basin. So it does have a distinct geologic history. Upper Klamath Lake in that picture used to be Lake Modoc. And it has a different evolutionary history. What I mean by that is that because of these historical connections to the Northern Great Basin, there's different fish communities, high rates of endemism. We got cool fish like the marbled sculpin, the blue chub and others, and endemic suckers. And then there's the lake. It's the largest lake by surface area in Oregon, and yet its average depth is about this deep. It turns neon green in the summer. So this basin is fundamentally different because of its network topology, which I know is kind of a jargony word, but instead of being dendritic and branched like a tree, it's almost like a wagon wheel, where there's this big lake in the middle fed by all these tributaries. So many of these inherent kind of traits of the basin are different. And then one of my favorite parts about it, which you can see in the bottom picture there, is that it's just peppered with groundwater features. Because the east slope of the Cascades has this porous geology where runoff goes subsurface, and then it just kind of pops up everywhere. And how it pops up, there are springs that range from tiny seeps to rivers that come out of the ground at 500 CFS. So they're incredibly diverse spring features. And what's also really neat is that they're diverse in terms of their temperature. So places like Spring Creek, that big river I was just talking about, it comes up at 6 degrees, while some of the springs up the Sprague come up at about 17 degrees C. So you'll be sampling fish in winter and it actually feels good to put your hands in the water. So there's extremely diverse hydrologies among all the different streams that might potentially support salmon in the future. And so how are fish going to use these habitats? And there's really great, huge investments going on in restoration right now, and a lot of process-based restoration. And if we want to be able to evaluate how this might affect salmon or how we might be able to tailor it to specifically support future runs of the salmon, it's important to be able to anticipate, where are they going to be in the basin? How are they going to use all these different habitats? And there's some great, promising, existing approaches that people are doing right now, people in this room, and that includes using hatchery Chinook salmon and putting them into the upper basin and looking at their patterns of habitat use and survival. We have landscape models and different quantitative approaches based on that have been parameterized in other systems that can help us anticipate what parts of the basin would different species be in. And what I'm going to propose today is that these are great approaches, and that a complementary approach with complementary strengths and weaknesses could be to look at existing native salmonids in the upper basin and see how they do it. Enter the redband trout. So redband trout, this is one pictured here that Jordan, a graduate student who's in the room, caught in the lake. And they've been in the basin during this distinct evolutionary and geologic history. And they exist as locally adapted, genetically distinct populations that are throughout the upper basin. They're the last remaining fishery for the Klamath tribes, following the failed recruitment of endemic suckers and the loss of indigenous fish. So they're a really important fish. They also support important recreational fisheries. And they have a life cycle that mimics that of Pacific salmon and steelhead. So they emerge in all these different tributaries. Just like smolts, they swim downstream at age 0, 1, or 2. But instead of going to the ocean, they go to Upper Klamath Lake, where they behave just like coho and chinook in the ocean. And I'll get to that in a little bit. In fact, I think if you look at this fish, it kind of looks like a cross between a summer steelhead and a spring chinook. So what can they tell us about patterns of habitat use for future runs of steelhead and chinook? So to answer that question, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a series of case studies that our research group has done in collaboration with ODFW, the Klamath Tribes, Trout Unlimited, and other groups. And they supported Ph.D. dissertations for Nick Hallbeck and Jordan Ortega, who's in the room. So I'm going to start with what was basically a good old classic colorum and fallorum study, where we put temperature transmitting radio tags in adult redband trout, and then we followed them, and using mobile telemetry and stationary telemetry, we tracked them through the full annual cycle across the entire upper basin to see what habitats they used, and we also sampled their diets through that time to understand their seasonal energetics. So we started by tagging about, we tagged about 100 adult fish in Upper Klamath Lake in the spring. So I'm just going to kind of also chronologically walk through the year. So in the summer, the lake gets to about 25 degrees C, pH gets to close to 10, and oxygen can crash. So even fish that are bulletproof, that you could like fathead minnow, I'm pretty sure you can drop kick a fathead minnow into like a boiling vat of acid, and it's going to make it for a little bit. So they die. They die sometimes in fish kills, right? So Upper Klamath Lake is gnarly in the summer. And virtually every single, there was one tag that didn't leave the lake. I'm pretty sure it was the dead fish where the activity code was broken. But anyways, virtually every single redband trout left the lake during the summer. And some of them were at the south end of the lake, so they made long distance migrations of 40 to 60 kilometers to get to their summer habitats. And those summer habitats were almost entirely the large groundwater influenced habitats adjacent to the lake. And you can see them in the pictures here. I'm going to try this laser point. So if you haven't been to the Rocky Point, Pelican Bay area, you got to go there in the summer and paddle around. It's a beautiful spring-fed wetland, and it's pictured here. This is the Wood River Delta, and then there's the Lower Williamson. So that's where the vast majority of our fish went. But you can see they're these big, luxurious, kind of cool water habitats. And something that surprised us is even though every single fish left the lake, which gives you the impression that it's lethal, several of them, midsummer, decided they didn't really like the summer habitat they were at, and they switched. They moved across the lake to a different habitat. Okay, so as early as about mid-August, the second the lake looks like slightly less neon green, we started to actually see fish start to move back in the lake. And then by about peak fall, when you get these beautiful scenes like this with some snow on Mount McLaughlin, most of our fish were back in the lake. So they move back to the lake in the fall, but then just as soon as they get back there, some start leaving again. And that's because, I think I kind of hinted it, with that opening slide, these aren't like traditional omicas that spawn in the spring. They start spawning as early as November. So fish start leaving right away to start staging and take part in spawning. So then we see the second annual long distance migration that these fish make when they move up out of the lake to go to their spawning grounds. And so we didn't capture all the spawning sites with 100 fish, but the green dots on this slide shows the areas where we saw fish spawning. And again, we were surprised because one of the most popular spawning sites that we saw was at Beatty Gap, about 100 kilometers upstream of the Sprague River at the confluence of the North and the South Fork of the Springs. And if you follow research in the Klamath Basin, you may have heard of Beatty Gap because historical analyses and ancient DNA analyses found that spring Chinook used to spawn there. And as we tracked fish there, we also realized, so there are these high densities of spawning redband trout there, but there are also some densities of local anglers. And so in response, ODFW enacted a seasonal closure to protect those spawning fish. And as I mentioned, in addition to tracking fish across the landscape and seeing these two long distance movements, we're also sampling their diets during this time. And that allowed us to estimate their seasonal energy budgets. And what we found, as you can see here, is that they're in massive positive energy balance when they're in the lake. They are just hammering blue chubs, tui chubs, marbled sculpin. Sometimes they like a little dessert of some leeches. But you can see in the summer, when they're on these beautiful cold water habitats that people fly from across the country to go fly fishing there, they're not actually in positive energy balance. Those habitats are really acting as water quality refuge habitats. So they're getting all their positive energy balance in the lake. So the key takeaways from this first case study, first of all, I've been in meetings and I hear people say, Upper Klamath Lake is a terrible place for salmonids. And they are exactly right when it comes to late June, July, and early August. But the rest of the year, the water quality is suitable and it's potentially incredibly productive and could produce a massive amount of juvenile salmon in the future if they can use the habitat. Secondly, we found that adult salmonids could survive brief transit through the lake, which is probably good news for migrating sampling steelhead. The fact that those spring-influenced areas around the lake provided thermal refuge for hundreds or thousands of these 4 to 12 pound fish probably bodes well for their ability to support spring Chinook thermal refuge in the future. And lastly, the Beatty Gap area is still a hotspot for salmonid spawning. And this also kind of supports the notion that these fish could be proxies for Chinook and steelhead because they're spawning in high densities in the same place that spring Chinook used to spawn. Okay, so after we finished that first study, we had a meeting with ODFW and some representatives from the Klamath tribes and TU, and we tried to figure out, well, what should we do next? What's the next knowledge gap we should address? And so we all agreed that one thing that we knew very little about were juveniles. Juveniles are cryptic compared to adults. People don't harvest them. And there's oftentimes less known about juveniles than adults. Oh crap, I'm gonna get that. I jumped in, I forgot I got this little adult part. All right, forgive me. Okay, so the next we did do one more adult study, and we looked at fluvial redband trout in the Oregon part of the Klamath River. And what's so cool, again, is that these dams in the picture, they're no longer there, but they were when we did the study. And we wanted to know, what do fish do when they're in this fragmented landscape where they don't have access to cold water like they did in the past? So we tagged some fish, just the same way we did in the Upper Basin. We tagged fish in between J.C. Boyle and Keno Dam in that Spencer Creek, in that reach that's fed by Spencer Creek where there's now spawning Chinook salmon. But we asked, there's big springs downstream of J.C. Boyle Dam, and we asked, well, what do these fish do if they don't have access to those springs? And the temperatures get in the mid-20s over the summer. So this is a time series of temperature. The blue and red lines are the temperature in the lake and the river. You can see they're about the same. But the dots are the tag transmissions from the fish. So you can see the blue dots are those adfluvial fish in the lake, and you can see they're in like the 12 to 18 degrees C range, but the Keno fish are pinned on that red line. So this shows they're not finding any kind of like, microhabitat heterogeneity. There is no thermal refuge in that main stem part of the Klamath. And if you look at histograms of their tag transmissions, you can see they're about 25 degrees C, whereas those fish in the refuges are like 8 to 18. So we thought, oh boy, these fish are going to be in terrible shape at the end of the summer. They're going to look like maybe some of us at the end of this conference. Saturday morning. But it turned out, we looked at condition factor with Fulton's K and biological impedance, and we actually found that those fish in the Kino Reach, they lost less condition than the fish in the lake. So we thought, well, wow, I wouldn't have thought that these fish would have this great thermal tolerance, because we usually think of redbands as being these kind of super fish in the interior regions, and those Kino fish are actually from a coastal lineage of Micus. So we worked with Erica Eliason, and we worked with Kara Onliff down at ODFW to do some streamside respirometry trials. And in these plots, we have temperature versus aerobic scope, and temperature versus recovery time from an anaerobic challenge. I think it's better described as a death chase. And what you can see is that the Kino fish maintain their aerobic scope as the temperature gets up to 25, whereas the upper Klamath Lake fish didn't, and the Kino fish also didn't require any recovery time. So whether this is a genotypic, adaptation or if it's more affirmation, we're not exactly sure. But what's clear is that these coastal lineages of Omicus can exhibit really high thermal tolerance in the field. So the key conclusions here is first that the coastal lineage, which is likely going to be the future steelhead runs, that they actually have high thermal tolerance, and redband aren't some superfish that couldn't be a proxy for steelhead. And I think that an important implication for conservation is that temperature alone is probably not going to govern summer habitat use. So all the fish left the lake when it was 25 degrees C, and all the fish did fine in Kino when it was 25 degrees C. But the lake has the additional synergistic stressors of DO and pH. So if we can maintain the habitat and not pile on these stressors, then fish are possibly going to do okay through warm summers. Okay, I can skip the intro about the juveniles because I gave that a couple slides back. So after that meeting, here's what we did. We designed this riverscape study on the Sprague River, and we decided to work in the Sprague because it's the longest tributary of Upper Klamath Lake, but it's also highly impacted. Much of it has no riparian vegetation left. There's a lot of cows, and it gets really warm. The maximum daily temperatures in the Sprague are as high as 28 or 29 degrees C in summer. And usually people are like, oh my gosh, but we're in California, and y'all have some crazy stuff down here. So I know you're probably like 29, it's like 49 down here. So now we're pivoting to Jordan Ortega's thesis, and so he did a study in close collaboration with ODFW, where we, based on these USGS geomorphology work that delineated these valley segments of the river, we structured our sampling around that, and we distributed these sites throughout about 80 kilometers of the main Sprague River to ask, well, where are juveniles rearing in this seasonally warm impacted river system? So the key thing that we found is that trout were incredibly patchily distributed. Most places we sampled had 0 or close to 0 trout, and the vast majority of trout were in these rare, high abundance spots. So that led us to ask, well, are there any sort of unique landscape features that are where these fish are found, that are supporting this disproportionate abundance of fish? So the landscape features that we hypothesized would be associated with habitat use were areas with high slope, where there would be turbulent ripples and rapids that would maintain high dissolved oxygen and allow fish to have fast metabolisms with warmer temperatures, or areas that remained cool and had a lot of groundwater. And so this black line here shows slope, and you can see there's a really high gradient, unique feature here in Chiloquin Narrows and the Chiloquin Canyon. And then the bars show how much gaining flows there are in each valley segment based on USGS groundwater studies. And again, you can see there's only 2 areas that have a lot of gaining flows, Comcan Reach and then the Beatty area that we talked about earlier. Okay. So if we look at patterns of fish density based on spring and summer electrofishing, or off-channel snorkel surveys during summer, what you can see is there's these 3 corresponding peaks of abundance. So we have high abundance of fish in the Chiloquin Narrows, even though that's where maximum temperatures get as high as 28 or 29. And then we have high abundance in the Comcan Reach and the Beatty Gap. And if I throw it back on the map, it's these 3 different parts of the landscape which are really spread out. And I'm going to talk more about tracking these fish through time and their fate in the foodscape sessions tomorrow, so I'm not going to unpack that too much. So the key implication to this is that there's not just one single landscape feature that's good for salmonids. Here it was two distinctly different features that have different habitat conditions, but they both hold high numbers of fish. And those spring-fed areas are critically important to juvenile rearing and spawning, but groundwater is under threat in the Klamath Basin. First of all, it's sensitive to drought. The magnitude of springs, USGS studies shows that it's real sensitive to precipitation like the last 5 years. But also in the lower part of the upper basin, the water table dropped by 25 feet when irrigation switched from surface water to groundwater. So it's really important that we conserve these groundwater resources. And what I'll be talking about tomorrow is that we think that in the warm habitats, if they're food rich and remain oxygenated throughout the 24-hour cycle, they can still function to support fish, not just to survive, but actually to put on a lot of growth during these warm summer temperatures. And lastly, to give a plug to Ryan Belmore's talk tomorrow, the work that Stephanie Carlson and others do, that narrows that warm site that was downstream. It's tens of kilometers from the nearest spawning site, and yet we see small H0 fish rearing there. So this suggests that as juveniles, fish are doing seasonal migrations and they're rearing in non-natal habitats. So those sort of exciting, interesting juvenile life histories are probably going to be important for future runs of salmon and steelhead. All right, so I want to close my talk by addressing two things. There are many uncertainties, but two things that I think are key uncertainties about how future runs of salmon are going to use the upper basin. The first is the lake. So I told you how valuable it is for those adult redband trout, but they're this big. So what about juvenile redband trout, future juvenile salmon and steelhead, that are about this big? Because they probably are going to relate to the environment different in terms of disease or competition or predation. And so Jordan, working with ODFW and the Klamath tribes, led a study where we put tiny little radio tags in these sort of smolt-sized redband trout. And this was a pilot study, but many of these fish did go to the lake, and they migrate in spring, so they get to the lake kind of late in spring, and they spend a few weeks there before water quality conditions dry them out, and they use different parts of the lake than the adults do. So that is, I think, really encouraging to know that juvenile salmonids can take advantage of this productive resource. But we definitely need more future studies on this, and we're trying to fundraise to put more tags out and get a better understanding of this. And secondly, I think a key thing is to understand what are the water quality conditions that drive fish out of the lake. This is going to govern the duration of time that salmonids can use the lake, and it would be great for informing, there's process-based restoration to reduce nutrient loading on the lake, and it would be great to know, what might targets be that are relevant to salmonids. And we have some information on relationships between max daily temperature and fish that are arriving on refuges, but these are arrival dates, and this is a 40-kilometer migration for some of these fish, so we don't know the departure dates. And it would be great if we could take advantage of this array that USGS is maintaining. There's an acoustic array with 80 receivers on the lake. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do next is put tags in adult redband trout at the southern end of the lake and see what are the water quality conditions that cause them to change their movement behavior and start looking for refuge. And thank you so much for letting me talk about redband trout. And hopefully I can take some of your questions during the panel if you have any.
That was an amazing talk. Myself, I did some work in the 80s on Upper Klamath Lake, and one of the things I did was collect plankton for food because we were raising suckers. And I found that there was so much daphnia, the schools, I think a trout would just swim with its mouth open and just get plenty enough to grow. I would also say this interacts with a couple of very large restoration projects. We have agency Barnes reflooding, it's 12,000 acres. Another project like Emerald that's visible from space. That just happened right now. That's almost 20 square miles, I believe. And then another project that the Klamath tribes just did that's not all that publicized is they reflooded Upper Klamath Marsh, which is on the Upper Williamson River. That project is 27,000 acres that they just reflooded. They just busted open some levees. A lot like Kellyx talked about, there was a lot of argument and debate about exactly how to do it, and in the end they just went out there and broke the levees and reflooded it. And Kirk Canyon flowed for the first time in 6 years this year because of that. So we're seeing some good things, and we're looking towards the future. We have 2 more talks. Right now, we're going to do a 15-minute break, okay? So that means, at 10:35, please come back, and we have 2 more really great talks today. So that's it. Thank you for the speakers. It's a tough year. We're going to get through this. Our next speaker, the phone will wake up. Our next speaker is Desiree Tullos. Desiree Tullos is the minor endowed professor of biological and ecological engineering department. Wow. At Oregon State University. Desiree's research emphasizes the sustainable management of rivers by examining the intersections of hydraulics, infrastructure, ecology, and society. Current projects include a river response to dam removal, mitigation of cyanobacteria blooms, connectivity and sediment storage in modern floodplains, ecohydraulics, and habitat restoration. That's right up our alley. I love this stuff. Her research program heavily emphasizes engaging and mentoring undergrad students' research and societal relevance. She also serves on multiple boards and science and engineering advisory panels to help translate science into practice and policy. And one known random fact about Desiree is that when she's not doing stuff like this, she's on the water, somehow, in some form. I'd like to welcome Dr. Desiree Tullos.
Good morning. All right, I want to start actually by saying a big thank you. A big thanks to the SRF organizers for all the work it takes to put this meeting together, to Dana and Mike and everyone who put this session together, and Tommy. I'm just so grateful to be here, to learn from y'all, to learn from the river, and to get to share with you what we're learning. You might notice the title here is a little bit different than what was advertised. Originally, I was planning to talk about some work that we're doing in primary production and water quality, but as I looked over the agenda, it turns out that my master's student, Izzy Tang, is presenting the primary production work this afternoon. John Oberhertzer, sorry John, I took a picture of your last name, with the Kurd tribe is presenting water quality data. There's a bunch of other folks who present some parts. So I made some adjustments and I moved us upstream a little ways. And so we'll be looking at some images and results of what happened in the reservoirs as these dams were removed. Also, just want to quickly thank a bunch of people. We'll come back to some of this later, but Will and Christine in particular, 2 graduate students working with me, whose results are some of the results we presented here. All right, we're going to talk about sediment. But before we do that, I just want to point out some of the major wins associated with these dam removals. I think a lot of us are probably aware there's some big benefits for fish, but there's these other really important wins related to water quality, the elimination of the cyanobacteria blooms. Jonny was talking about the neon green color of Upper Klamath Lake. There were 4 reservoirs that turned this color that were removed. And that cyanobacteria, it's pretty near and dear to my heart because I'm a person that spends a lot of time in rivers generally, but in the Klamath in particular, this is like one of the big wins in terms of eliminating cyanobacteria blooms. And then the restoration of people. And so as a group, when we first started thinking about what are the ways that things that we want to be able to learn and contribute to in the Klamath, we spent a lot of time talking to folks, talking to Mike and other people at the Yurok tribe, and thinking about the intersections of other things happening in the basin, and ultimately decided to prioritize our work on the restoration of water quality and what those dam removals meant for water quality. And so we assembled this all-star cast of folks. We were able to get a reasonable grant from Oregon Sea Grant. But I just want to take a second to acknowledge these folks. It has literally been like the honor of my career, of my life, to get to work with these amazing people. It's a really interdisciplinary group, from microbiology to environmental anthropology. Laurel Genzoli is a sort of mastermind of primary production in rivers, and then a bunch of folks with the Yurok tribe in particular. I just want to acknowledge Brooke Thompson, who's just been such a bright spot and some dark moments over the course of the project and just generally, and I'm just so grateful for working with all these folks. We literally kind of just dove in terms of water quality. So I'll quickly summarize the stuff that we're doing, what I'll be able to talk to today. We're working on reservoir erosion, which you've just see a lot of photos of. Also studying how there's a dissolved oxygen sag that occurred in the river, a number of them. We'll look at those together today. Is driving those. Ecohydraulics and how plants, the primary producers in the system, are changing. We've got some surprises there that Missy will talk about later. And that's really like 1/3 of the project. The other two sort of legs of the stool are this sort of environmental anthropology and sociocultural work, and this knowledge co-production work that work is in large part leading on how people understand what's happening with the river and the changing water quality and what this idea of river health means. So I don't have time to talk about any of those other things, unfortunately, but it's a really neat collection of people to be working with. I do want to just say, and not to be a downer, but a couple weeks ago we were notified that our federal grant was canceled. So we are currently not sure where things are going to go. Trying to sort of stay the course and do what we can, and so represent where we're at today, but it's uncertain sort of where we're going to go from here. But we'll go somewhere. So we'll start with this concept of reservoir erosion. This matters, the sediment matters from a salmon perspective, it matters from other organisms in the river, and the source of the sediment and how it evolved is really useful for us to understand both what's happening in the Klamath and other river systems with wildfires and other dam management problems. So this is Kopko. Just as it was immediately after it was dewatered, and we'll see lots more images of this particular reservoir. But before we do, I'm going to take a couple steps back and talk a little bit about the sediment that was there. It was a lot of sediment, around 12 million cubic meters. That's like 460,000 of those really, really big super dump trucks. So it's a lot of sediment. And it was, the vast majority of it was really fine materials. So silts and clays, and then a bunch of old dead algae, organic matter. So that was what was behind those reservoirs that you're going to see pictures of leaving. And there's some unique things about this, which make, a lot of the conversation early on when we were organizing these science coordination meetings was like, well, how is it different from the LWA? And these are radically different projects. There's some things that are similar, but there's a lot that's very different. And one of those is the sediment. So you can see there's, very little gravel in the system. LWA was all gravel, mostly gravel and sand. But instead we have a bunch of silts and clays. And it was really, really wet clay and wet fines, and so that matters because the liquid limit here is like an engineering term for when sediment starts to act like a liquid versus acting like a solid. And so we think about gravels and sands from a geomorphic perspective. There's a set of sort of physics that governs, and they're pretty simple. They're really simple. And then you start to get things that when they start to act like a liquid, we call it non-Newtonian physics. It gets really complicated, but way more interesting. And it happens all over the landscape, and we just don't really have good data to understand what's happening. So the Klamath gave us really great opportunity to study these processes, complex processes that we don't have a lot of opportunities to study. So really, really wet, essentially, we're expecting the sediment to act more like a liquid than a solid. And we saw that in the lab. These were some samples that were conducted prior to dam removal. We didn't collect them, but River Design Group, in collaboration with some undergrads in our program, were monitoring sort of what happened to these sediments dried. So it came in as this like chocolate pudding texture, and then as it dried, you can see it's consolidating, you see these tension cracks developing, and it's gaining strength. And this is a preview of sort of what's going to happen in the reservoirs as it starts to drain. We see very different behavior as it shifts from that like liquid-like movement to solid-like movement. So we knew this was going to happen fast, so what we did was to install a bunch of trail cams essentially on 2 of the reservoirs. We had 4 at Kopko and 5 at Iron Gate. We positioned them in places where we thought something interesting was going to happen, like at tributary junctions or like at the river, the delta. And bless his heart, Will looked at every one of those photos, which ended up being a lot. And he tracked these individual failures. This is at Camp Creek and Iron Gate. You'll see more of this site, but essentially looked at each of these failures and tracked them over time. And so he put them in this time-lapse software, and you can sort of see up here in the corner, he labeled the type of failure and then had a bunch of notes. Like, notes could have been things like when the surface emerged here, or when this gravel, cobble was exposed, so that's an indication when the river had reached its historic bed. And it was a lot of work. He had tracked over 60 failures and over 35,000 photos, so this is sort of the grind of grad school. But he also did a lot of voting, so I don't feel too sorry for him. But it was we ended up developing some really neat, starting to understand some neat things about what happened in the reservoir, so hopefully it's worth it. This is Copco. And Copco is a really neat place in the world, I think, in part because like around 160,000 years ago, this area was dammed by a lava dam. And so you can see some of the sediment here. These are old diatoms, old lake sediments, essentially like biochemical sediments that were formed as a lake bed from all the diatoms, 160,000 years ago. So it's a former lake bed, and then overlaid on top of it was all the silt from the dam, from Copco 1. So it's a really wide valley, really thick, deep sediments. And so we saw some really neat flow sliding behaviors. So we'll look at this one a couple of times, but just draw your attention to some of the things happening here. These are, again, acting like a liquid. And some really neat, unique things happening from a geomorphic perspective, that the channel, and the main channel is actually over here, sort of out of the view, but you can see these big failures that emerge, and it's emerging as it drains. So like as soon as it's exposed to air, it really starts when it starts to move. It happens quickly, like in the course of hours to a day, and a couple of days, but we're not talking about like months. Like originally we're thinking, well, we'll do monthly surveys, and this was all, the exciting stuff had already happened within a week. So that is just one example of Copco. I'll just show you some quick data. These were collected by the Cruz tribe and at a USGS gauge. And so we have stage height, you see the discharge, the elevation of the reservoir dropped, sediment pulse comes up, and it sort of, as the soil drains and gets stronger over time, we see that the turbidity is really decreasing, and you can see the axis over here. We're talking about a lot of sediment. The other thing I want to draw your attention to here is that there were these pulse flows that were essentially like annual flood events that were like around 2,000 CFS that were released from Upper Klamath Lake to try to mobilize more sediment. Because remember that the goal with dewatering during winter was to try to get the sediment out as quickly as possible and as much as possible while the salmon weren't in the river. So we wanted to kind of like move it out quick. And so they sent these flows down to try to mobilize some sediment. You'll see in both of the sites, it did create a moderate pulse, but not maybe as big and as effective as some of the other things that can be happening in the system. All right, so key thing here I just want to draw your attention to though is like it's when the reservoir is drained. That's when we first started. Because it's this liquid like sediment, it's the draining process is when we're going to see the most sediment being mobilized, and these smaller like re-wetting over short term is not going to be very effective at moving large volumes of sediment. These are the types of failures that Will documented in those many hours of clicking through photos, and this shows you turbidity over the failure types, and that we had way more flow sliding behavior here. There were some these other types of failures are called retrogressive slumps. It's like these slumps where they kind of march their way backwards, and those did occur, but mostly still because it was that liquid behavior. We saw mostly just this flow sliding behavior that generated the most amount of sediment. And some of these were really far away from the channel. Like I've been talking about like hundreds of meters away from the channel. So it's not just sort of like your classic like small channel like incision and then a little bit of widening. We saw really large volumes of sediment moving out of the system because they were essentially acting like a liquid. So that's Copco. Let's take a look at Iron Gate. This is a pretty different system in the sense it's a pretty confined valley. The slopes are steeper. The sediment is not nearly as thick. And so we saw some different behaviors at this site. This is one of my favorites. I can spend forever looking at this one. This is at Camp Creek, that one I showed you earlier where there's a bunch of failures happening. So you can start to see it's going to happen here. The Camp Creek's going to come out over here. There's a big flow slide that happens here. We'll watch this one a couple times. Oh, this part right here. See the channel's narrowing. This is a really sort of unique
geomorphic process where those flow slides essentially are like coming together and narrowing up the channel, because they're essentially like filling the channel. And now you can start to see the historic bed emerging. This is an old railroad grade that's still there. That's just so cool. It's forever. All right, but we can move on. So some more of those data. So we see the drawdown effects here as they're draining the reservoir, sediment turbidity comes up. And then we see these flow pulses. What's interesting about these flow pulses that are slightly different from Kopko upstream, but you see that the sediment pulses come out as the reservoir again is dewatered. So that this just really illustrates how the sediments have to get wet to really be moved. Otherwise, they turn into concrete, which is makes it hard. The restoration plan's harder. The tribes in the West have been working really hard at doing and have done an amazing job with restoration of the footprints of these reservoirs. But the sediment's not easy to work with. That dry, hard sediment. And once it gets wet, that's when it really starts to move. The key thing that we took away from this, and I'm leading to some bigger conversation about what we've learned from the Klamath and what that means in terms of sediment management and other systems. We have a dewatering process here, failures occurring here, and then we don't see a lot of failures. We didn't see really any failures happening for those flow pulses downstream, and I think part of that is because a lot of the sediment that came out with those flow pulses wasn't those big, massive failures at Iron Gate. It was instead like what was happening at the Coffer Dam, which is a whole other part of the infrastructure that we won't be able to get into. But again, it's the draining of those wet soils where we see big mobilization of fine sediments. I guess we'll point to the fact that these hatched areas reflect where the reservoir is expanding, is contracting versus these vertical lines where it's expanding. So again, reservoir is contracting, draining, it's leading to those massive failures. And then lastly on this part, I'll just point out that we did use some terrestrial laser scanning and try to actually map values to these things. And this phenomenon of the channel narrowing that we saw is something that's quite unique, and it's illustrated in these data here where this is the water surface elevation. It's dropping, and then it kind of gets flat as that historical bed is emerging. But this is the channel width, and you see it kind of bouncing up and down, up and down, up and down, especially here. And that again is that sort of those flow slides that are narrowing up the channel before it then widens back out and exhumes the historical channel bed. So the last thing about the geomorphology here is that nick points are this feature that occur in rivers. Oftentimes it's a change in change in slope over a very short distance, and it has been sort of the eminent feature that leads to erosion in a lot of dam removals, but we didn't see them here. And we didn't see any evidence of it anywhere in the system, maybe at one tributary junction, but where there was some coarse material. But I think the reason for that is that there was essentially, the soil needs strength, right, to hold a step, and it was just wet. Essentially, it was just liquid. And so we didn't see any nick points, and this feature that is so common at dam removals really wasn't present here. It wasn't a dominant feature. And so we've got these old school, and there's nothing wrong with the Doyle's or the Evans paper. This is from like 2002 and 2007, and sort of we have these ideas about what we expect is going to happen with dam removals. It's going to size, and then it's going to widen, and then it'll be done. But the reality is that I think if we start looking really more at form and processes, that there's way more diverse versions of what happens in rivers, and that matters if we care about where that sediment goes and when it gets released. And so I think this idea of the channel evolution model itself needs to evolve a bit, and we need to think more about what's happening in a system than just assuming that we know what's going to emerge. Some real diverse behavior there. So I'll talk about the ecology, do dissolved oxygen stuff in a second, but I just want to summarize that there was some really cool stuff that we haven't seen in other places. So the Klamath is teaching us a lot, both about sort of basic physics, but also about ecology, and that there are these diverse pathways for how channels can evolve. We do know that the location matters, so we can't just again assume that one place, even within the same system, is going to look similar. Because we did see some pretty different, large differences between Kopko and Iron Gate. And that this leads us to thinking about how do we design drawdowns for other dam removal removals. If we want to maximize how much sediment is being released and we have a bunch of fines, we need to get it drained as quick as possible. The goal is to try to get the sediment out as fast as possible. The drawdown rate needs to be faster than the soil can drain. And so we didn't quite get that at the Klamath. There were some constraints in terms of like outlet capacity and other things, but if we really wanted to maximize how much sediment, or if you wanted to minimize it, then you draw it down slower than the sediment can drain. So we're really starting to learn more about how to apply these concepts to other dam removals. And then those flow releases, they did have a moderate and positive effect, but they were, and in Iron Gate in particular, it was amplified by the fact that the pool was refilling and kind of sustaining wetness in these areas. But for a bigger effect, we need bigger, longer duration flow pulses rather than those short duration pulses. And then the last thing I'll say about the geomorphology is that when we left in the fall, the river looked a lot like this. And it was lacking the basic features that we think of in a river. It was a plain bed system, didn't have the scour pools that you'd expect out here, or big gravel bars, not a lot of riffles. But we got some really big flows in the river this year, and so we'll be back later this month. I'm really excited to see what happened. There was a bunch more sediment that came out of the system. And so I'm expecting that those bigger flows have helped continue with like the reset of the system and created the habitats that the organisms in the river need. Still beautiful even in the fall. All right, and then lastly, why do we care about sediment? I think probably one of the big reasons that sediment mattered in the Klamath was its impact on dissolved oxygen and the fears that emerged around it. So we started, years ago thinking about this problem, and this is not, I want to be clear, this picture is not from the dam removals. It was a fish kill that happened after a wildfire. This photo was taken by a Cruz tribal member, and as a result of a bunch of ash falling in a debris flow that delivered a bunch of ash to the river that dropped the dissolved oxygen. So that was in 2022, but even before then we were worried about what was going to happen with the DO in the river. And if you look across the various reports that people produced in anticipation, you see these wide ranges of like the minimum DO value could have been as low as 0.2 or up to 8. It depended on like the type of water year, but even sometimes within the same water year we get differences. And in terms of how far downstream it would take to get there were estimates of it would take somewhere around 12 to some, it's one estimate somewhere close to 150 miles downstream. And the reality is that we saw with the group data that the DO dropped to went to zero at Walker Bridge, which is like 35 miles downstream, but by the time you get like 60 miles downstream, then there was still a SAG, but it was like down to like 5 milligrams per liter. And so what this is telling us is that there's some errors and some issues in the models that we can resolve. And so we did a bunch of work to try to figure that out. And in particular, we were interested in what was driving those different DO SAGs or those drops in DO. And so it could have been these three mechanisms, the latter two of which are associated with sediment. So chemical oxygen demand is like the minerals and chemicals that are in that sediment, and once it gets resuspended, it gets oxidized, sucks oxygen out of the water. And then the biological oxygen demand, essentially the bacteria chewing up organic material and then decomposing. So this gives you a sense, we were out there the day Drawdown began. This gives you a sense of what our fieldwork looked like. These were sites were all dominated by gravel and cobble, and then what became mantled in this thick lens of fine sediment. This is Christine, the Ph.D. student leading the work, that steps in like up to your thighs, in January, in thick sediment. And then, so one of the questions we're trying to ask is like, okay, these are the data. Again, these data are collected by the tribe that show these different dips in dissolved oxygen. And so this, the light blue is Iron Gate. It's like a few hundred feet downstream from the former dam, and then there's the Shasta, which is like 12 miles downstream. I should know that off the top of my head. But so we saw this first drop. It was short. It lasted around 7 hours. And it was a small drop, and then it was followed by the subsequent drops. So this large drop that a few days after the Copco added was, the tunnel was blasted, and it got down to 0, and that lasted from start to finish around 4 days. We got a next one that came, lasted around 10 days from start to finish, and then a small fourth one. It was much smaller. And so our goal between analyzing these data and a bunch of incubations we did in the lab was to try to figure out what is the mechanism that defined each of these drops. And I'll just give you the high-level results here that we are understanding now is that this first one was probably the hypolinitic water release. There was very little organic material and very little turbidity associated with it. But then we get this first drop here that was a significant one that happened really quickly, both in terms of how quickly it went down and how quickly it came back up, which suggested it's a chemical oxygen demand. By the time you get to this one, this looks more like a biological oxygen demand. It's much lower and much slower. And this one in the middle is probably a combination of both. So we have high organic content in all of these and high turbidity. So these bigger drops being associated with more with the sediment load than, for example, this initial like hypolinitic release. So just to summarize that part, we do see evidence that the sediment can impact DO, but that how severely, the severity of the impact depends on what mechanism is driving it. We probably need better models, but the models that were used beforehand were based on the Streeter-Phelps equation, which is like from the 1920s. It's a model of what happens to wastewater when you drop it in a river, and there's other mechanisms that are involved that we can improve on our estimations, and that we need both the field work and the lab to really unpack these mechanisms and understanding. So that I will wrap up and just make a plug for Issy's talk on the plants and algae. He's just giving a talk this afternoon along with John. There's also a talk on the benthic macroinvertebrate response to the sediment pulses. Some really interesting sort of surprises that we learned along the way about the plants and algae, and maybe their lack of sensitivity to some of the sediment. And then I just want to close with a huge thanks. Like I said, it's been the honor of my career to get to work with these amazing folks. I'm grateful for our funding from Sea Grant, and also just the students and other folks who have committed so much to learning with us along the way. So thank you so much, and hopefully you can have some conversation with Daniel. Thanks.
So I think we've heard a big diversity of talks, with the first two talks talking about matters of the heart, about ancestral knowledge, fixing the world. The second two getting into our learning and unlearning of modern TDK, the scientific TD code that will become the language that our descendants speak in the future. Our next speaker here is someone who I really respect. And is very good at seeing the big picture and tying all the threads together. A lot of us know him. He's done this duty right here, emceeing. You know that I'm talking about Tommy Williams from National Marine Fisheries Service right here in Santa Cruz. I know Tommy through a lot of the research, a lot of the talks and talking with him. He's taught me a lot about taking disparate threads of scientific evidence and putting them all together. Tommy has been a research biologist for National Marine Fisheries Service for the past 27 years and has been a research associate at the Institute of Marine Sciences, University of California, Santa Cruz since June 2001. His experience includes research that informs conservation and management decisions throughout coastal basins of California and Southern Oregon. He conducts various research throughout the state, as well as serving the Southwest Science Center's liaison with National Marine Fisheries Service West Coast Region and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Wow. For coastal basins of California. He served as a member of the Fisheries Coordination Group and Basin-wide Technical Working Group for the Klamath Basin Integrated Fisheries Restoration and Monitoring Plan, the IFRP for all y'all, and continues to serve as the lead for Southwest Fisheries Science Center for science issues related to the removal of 4 dams on the Klamath River and reestablishing fish populations. Tommy received his Ph.D. from Oregon State University, Master's from Montana State, and Bachelor of Science from Humboldt State University. And Tommy, welcome you. Please come on up. Oh, there you are.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Dana. I helped put these programs together, and you notice I put as many people as I could between Kellyx and Frankie and me. Also, purposely wanted the science talks right before mine, because my job is science, And I was very fortunate to work with Michael and Frankie and others in the Basin on science, but I was just a little cog on a little wheel, and there were some big cogs, but I'll tell you, all the cogs are important. Everybody has to. If a cog doesn't work, things can fall apart. We had some tricky calls here. What I'm going to do is I cut my teeth in the early 80s putting log structures in, cabling them in, uncabling them in, and luckily through time, I ended up at Oregon State working with a disturbance ecologist, which put me very well suited to think about dam removal. So I'm going to try to paint a picture of how I tried to communicate with the other scientists, but more importantly, like Mike said, is our partners and stakeholders and the public. In all of these cases of dam removal or big restoration, usually a crisis occurs because expectations exceeded opportunities. We worked on the Carmel River. 2-3 weeks after that dam came out, we were getting calls, did it work? And we really made an aggressive effort. Many of us made trips to the Elwha and other dam removals to try to learn how to communicate and how to put the science in a framework that folks could understand. I'd like to say we nailed it, but I think we did a reasonable good job, but we still have a long ways to go. So you might say, okay, great, we had dams in and dams out. And I first visited the Spencer Creek, preparing for the trial-like hearing, and just thought, boy, I hope sometime in my kid's lifetime I'll see salmon there. I tried that day. I saw probably 100 Chinook in Spencer Creek. It was phenomenal. But it's not that easy. Those pictures make it look easy. And I'm going to talk to you about the lane I skated and the baton I'm getting ready to hand off. There were a lot of things going on here. And so how do we make this bridge? So what I really want to push is that we really started early. My colleagues and I, not just within our agencies, I had developed a lot of it, relationships with tribal members and other workers in the basin since I worked at Oregon and at Oregon State. I'd gone to Humboldt, and many of the people working for the tribes were Humboldt graduates. And so we really started a concerted effort, how do we message this thing? And so one of my guiding documents was some work passed on to me by my lab director, Steve Lindley, was from Florida, where they really worked with communities and the science. I'm going to talk about the science part, but it's incredibly important that everybody at the table providing guidance and how we go through this has to be focused on the same vision, the same desired conditions of that watershed. Because you're going to be forced to make calls along the way, and if you're not focused on getting to the right part, you're going to make the wrong call, or you're going to make a call that has consequences. And I will tell you, sometimes it also informs you just sit back and let the fish in the river do their thing. And that actually was my biggest task, is sometimes not for us to get in the way. So to kind of steal my thunder is the focus has been and continues to be on restoring ecological conditions and physical processes. We're taking a system that was made static and making it dynamic, and that is complicated for people. Everything we do on that river, put those dams in, irrigation is all making things static, predictable. You see the Bureau's flow curves, their steps, and we're trying to release that, and that's scary for people. That is scary. One of the other things that happens, and I love Desiree's slides and Jonny's about this, but when we got into this and we were having to make quick calls, people get a little scared. And they're worried about optics, they're worried about interviews, and they're worried about saying, well, they want to be able to say we did everything we could. And the question is, did you do everything you should? And some of those things you should not do. And that's hard to do if you don't have that vision. It's really hard to do because there are points where you go, let's truck everything. Let's delay things and let us wait till we get more control of this. And as Desiree said, that call that our geomorphologist made to let her rip was absolutely critical and brave. So, one of the take-homes was, and we said this, the way we usually said this, the eye on the prize. But we had to focus and lock in on future conditions, and that was a dynamic environment where fish can move across the landscape. Every time something came up was how we get there. Is that getting us where we want to go? Because I'm not a sailor, but they tell me you tack and often go away from where you're going to get there. But a lot of the proposals put out from folks trained in the Western world are very technological. They're very prescriptive, and they're very, let's deal with the symptom and not the process. And we had to be very careful. So that touchstone of going back, is this getting us where we're going or not? There are some changes you have to make, and you have to evaluate things as you go through. We get curveballs, we have DO go down. All these rivers, when we take the dams out, they hand us some gifts. We had the McKinney fire, which was devastating. It dropped DO to zero for what, 3 days? We were panicked about the DO. You saw Desiree slide. It went down for a day. Those are and we delivered the sediment at a time we would normally have sediment moving through the system. That was trying to match our actions for fisheries, how they evolved, and that's when sediment moved. And so we really, really wrestled with the fact that we knew we were going to lose some fish in the river. We knew we were going to have fish in the gravel, and we took that on. And that was a hard one to take because people fought for every drop of water, for every fish in that river. What we wanted to do was minimize the impacts across brood years. We did not want multiple brood years to be hit. So you'll see a theme, diversity of habitat. I left the word diversity in, even though I'm not supposed to. I had variation, I had, and I almost put flummoxed in there, but I didn't. And it's all about creating a diverse habitat and processes that allow fish to express a range of life history types. And I'll go through that a little bit more. You will also see, if any of you have seen my other talks, about 10 or 12, 15 of my slides are the same slides I show every damn time. One of my mentors was an educator, and he had 4 laws of learning. The 4th one was repetition. The 5th one was repetition. The 6th one was repetition. And trying to go through the literature as part of my job for the science to inform our policymakers and also my colleagues and partners and stewards in the system is how do we look at what we got in the literature and reports to inform our decisions. So the model we worked on, and people will recognize this from ESA also, is to be viable and persist through time. Animals have to track change in the environment. That can be a fish that's in more, you heard talk Jonny, those fish individuals are tracking change in the environment by temperature. They track change if they can't get in one tributary because there's a landslide or a debris flow that blocks it, they go another way. Adults stray. Juveniles will come back sometimes as go out to the ocean, come back in 2s, 3s, or 4s, or 5-year-olds if they're Chinook. Steelhead can spawn more than once. This is that diversity that's expressed, and that allows them to track change in the environment. So this is where the disturbance ecology comes in. Think about the dynamic conditions we have on the West Coast. They're extremely dynamic. That we have, but the cadence and the scale and the frequency and the magnitude they're big. As lower into southeast Alaska after the 64 earthquake, there was an uplift of 33 feet in minutes. And it was a pink salmon spawning. Landslide on the Elk River, Oregon, it was probably a transient barrier that formed a barrier in that system for years, and then down cut it, and all of a sudden they mixed again. These are all just moving around in that system that happens. And we've got a darn variable ocean. The ocean is always changing. I try not to use the word we have poor ocean conditions, we have dynamic ocean conditions. And so with the freshwater doing all this and the oceans doing all this, it's pretty amazing these fish can make it, except that they have this breadth of activity, this portfolio to deal with this. So now think about what we've done to the system. We've done everything to constrain that dynamic. The lower left is Upper Klamath Lake, and we've disconnected the wetlands by dirt and by plumbing. And we've got hanging trips all over the place. All these things affect the ability of fish to track change. Fish cannot move across the landscape. They can't go from one place to the other, whether it's a smolt or just a fry getting through the day. They can't do it, they can't get up. So, won't bore you with VSP and ESA, but we put this model out to deal with listed species. But this is the same things that are important for fish we manage under Magnuson. Just remember, when they're endangered or threatened, they're at the bottom and they're moving up. But the same things are important. And so this is not a tool just to use once and now we got to come up with another one. That this is consistent for Emmett, Magnuson-Stevens, Marine Mammal Protection Act, everything we do here is that these viability criteria are consistent. You don't have to go to another toolbox. The problem is when we did this, and I in particular did a really bad job explaining this, and people said, oh, abundance, productivity. So you know what they all did? What do you think? They went to abundance, and how did they deal with that? How do people, what? Hatcheries, other ways like that. And so we realized we hadn't done a really good job explaining this. I hadn't done a good job explaining this, that it wasn't a NEPA checklist. This is one of the critical pieces of work along with the folks from Florida. This is a graduate, a colleague of mine at Oregon State, Joe Ebersol. And him and Bill Liss and others wrote this paper where these fish or these habitats or these river basins or these groups of populations have this capacity that as the environment changes, they move. They track that change in the environment. They move around, and that's how they deal with it. And they can, depending on what happens, the time frame, they move differently. This is what we've done. We have constrained the ability for fish to track these changes. That's what we've done. This was a very valuable model as we started talking about the actions on the dam removal, because it's real easy to put a dam in the middle of that picture and say, that's what we did. They can't use these habitats. And this framework allowed me to get a lot of conversations going with people, because people realized that there are more than one constraint. Taking those dams out was absolutely critical for any chance we have to restore these populations. But we have no guarantee yet. We still got a lot of work to do, but it would not have been possible without those dams out. So the way I cast this was a different way, is that it's not a checklist. You build upon a firm foundation, and that foundation has to be built on spatial structure and diversity. That diversity is habitat diversity, it's life history diversity, it's all kinds of things. And spatial structure, how's it laid out on the landscape? If you don't have those and you go to abundance, just think if you flip that thing over, it would just be balancing there. It would be extremely fragile. And that's what we've done with our population. We see them bouncing off the guardrails for numbers. So what's happened through us science people is we tend to do models. And I'm not a model person, but I look at them, and some of my best friends do modeling. And what happens is they ask us for data and show them, okay, what do we do here for velocity or sediment or whatever, and we give them a curve like this. Unfortunately, most of these places we've measured this over the last 30 or 40 years are systems that have been degraded and constrained. And so we see a curve like that, and that's what we use. But that's the curve that's out there. That's that diversity. Another paper I provide, especially with many of our the folks that come in and are not in total agreement with our activities. This, and some of them are financial backers of them, bringing this discussion about portfolios and the capacity of portfolios, and not just analytically, which we have people that do models that are not very similar to financial models for portfolios, but conceptually, that you know if you've got at least 3 populations, you're better than if you had just 2, especially in a dynamic environment. And this language is very useful to use also with policymakers. Why should I give a damn about biodiversity? But when we rolled this out, it was during the .com crash, and it was really easy to make them convinced that this was an important thing. Well, do we see this in the world? Yes, this is from Bristol Bay. This is Hilborn's work, what we often use. If you look through time, that these different basins were contributing different numbers of fish to the overall Bristol Bay sockeye fishery or sockeye population. So not one. Can you imagine if we did a management plan now, back in the day, we'd say, well, this one's got the most fish, that's the one we're going to keep, and we're going to not worry about the others. Not as working. And you also see that in number of recruits per spawners as variable across the landscape. That's diversity, that's spatial structure. Think about when we take the dams out, that's what we're doing. This is another great paper. People don't know this work very often, very well. A lot of work with OLIT microchemistry. Brennan and his co-authors, they looked at this, it was with Chinook and sockeye. And they looked at from year to year, like for the sockeye one on the bottom, in 2014, these fish were principally using this lake system. And then the next year, their production is coming out of a lot of riverine habitat. And then Chinook, you can see they're not using, we always say, okay, that's a spawning stream, we got 100 meters, multiply that by 7, this is how the production got. It's all over the place. It's all over the place at that scale. And this is more simply, if we're trying to make healthy and harvestable populations, this isn't just important for ESA. The resilient populations are spread across the landscape. And if anyone wants more access to these publications, information, let me know. But amazing work, but it makes sense. If you have more parts out across the landscape, you're going to do better. So this is where we were. And we're still kind of there for the Klamath. The fish are still responding. This is where we want to go. How are we going to get there? That's our desired future condition. To be honest, I would love to go back to ground zero, but ground zero I ain't getting to. But how do we get there, and how do we get to that spot? For all of you that are developing monitoring, how do we develop monitoring plans that are monitoring that now, but have to shift through this system? And how do we detect that? That's a real challenge for us. Again, spatial structure and diversity are the foundation of what we should be doing. When you look at a project at this scale, you have to say, how am I addressing that? So, one of my little plots was every time I got to work on a document during the Klamath, I snuck in my pyramid. And working with my co-conspirator Brian Fleur, USG, now he just retired from NOAA, but we always put it at the bottom of processes, and fish depend on those processes. And always making decisions. I would say the greater you diverge from historical conditions of hydrology and geology, the harder it is to get fish back. I was also very fortunate when I was at Oregon State to work with a few people. This is Dan Bottom, who's the lead author of this, and I think a lot of you would like it, but these folks really wrestled with resilience and talked about resilience and talked about the large scale. I was exposed to this in the late 80s, early 90s, when these people were thinking this way. This is Jim Lipatowic's crowd, and got a lot of time with him. And it's all about, you can see, I didn't make up any of this stuff. I shamelessly steal all of their, this is a great paper to see. Also, my major prof, Gordy Reeves, also had to talk to us about the time frames. They're long. And it's one of the things we really had to work hard on to get. We had to have guidelines for the reintroductions. The states developed them, that it wasn't going to be measured in just years. It was going to be measured in generations of fish. And those generations of fish were not 2 generations or 5, much more. Think about if you give it a 5-year, and that's in the middle of a drought, and we have poor ocean conditions. The response to that, the habitat might be better, but you just don't have that. You have to go long. We were talking on Tuesday's session that was here about, it's funny, it takes about 20, 25 years, a career of a person. I will say, tooting our own horn, it's one of the things that benefited us nymphs, that we had more or less the same players for 25 years. I would say what made the Klamath unique is we had such engaged stewards of the land who've been there forever. And that's different than being at a 3-year cycle, a 1-year cycle, whatever the cycles are. You take that longer view. Kellyx did a great job. It's tough to do. And not so much for the actions, but the expectations of the results. So the other thing, and Jonny did a great job talking about it, is connectivity. And that's one of the things. I mean, fish are moving all over the place. Now with pig tags and our genetic work, we're seeing that we have non-natal rearing happening. We had, believe it or not, we had a fish from the Trinity River steelhead show up in my research site down in Big Sur, based on otolith and molecular data. Not that they were contributing gametes, but they were there. And fish are moving all over this environment. And so disturbances happen. And the nature of the disturbance is what changed. And that kind of affects how we provide guidance. But we also have to prepare people for these disturbances. And I'm looking at Frankie because I was a pain in the ass. I realized quickly, Michael, and great story, started this really digging into the reservoir management plans and everything. Michael welcomed me there. We've known each other for years and sat down, and as you can tell, I love to talk. And Michael, more or less, he might have said something very wise, but the way I heard it was, show up, sit down, shut up, listen, and you'll hear, and then you'll learn. And I don't know how you told me, that's what went in my brain. And it worked. It was hard to drive 7 hours just to say, hello, I'm Tommy, Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and sit on my ass there and listen and talk. But until I did that, until I actually heard, and part of the thing was that was inspired by Brooke Thompson several years ago on this stage. She talked to me about the Yuroks having different words for past tense. And Frankie would tell you, I pulled him aside on the side of the Klamath one of our trips and said, explain that to me. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but time is something we need to think about. We need to think about it in the cadence of the disturbances and the disruptions in the whole system. And that's important. Time is so important. When I say that, action is urgent. But then as we let this lay out, I think it's quite arrogant of us to think that we know exactly how that landscape's going to look. What we do know is what the processes are. We have people like Jonny and people like Desiree showing us these are the processes we're seeing. We're getting better at it. No two dam removals are the same, but they mirror each other. There are principles. And so we have to think big. We have to provide something for the public to expect with disturbances. We need disturbances. Again, what we need to do is diversify what's happening, whether it's habitat, run timing, age structure, movement patterns. We have to take a static, simple system and develop all these curves. I think that I have a quote from Gordy has one also about that not every stream in a dynamic system is always at its peak production. The systems, it's a shifting mosaic of conditions, and so that's why you need this. Again, fish are good. I mean, when we had the first part of the drawdown, we were all worried. We had the tribal folks were looking down the lower stream looking for morts, and Taz called us and said, boy, a bunch of fish just pulled into Salmon River. They knew exactly what to do. Brian Clure, the geomorphologist, always thinking about sediment. Do you think with all that sediment, they just kept looking for clear water, which is probably as good as anything, raced upstream? But fish know what to do, and if we get out of the way. And that's sometimes hard to do. Sometimes we think we can land the plane. They're pretty good at it. So, this is where we were at last year. I had some other pictures, but the poppy picture looked nice given how my days have been the last couple of weeks. And losing colleagues, poppies, and the reservoir bottom are quite fun and exciting. Thank you so much for your patience. I do really want people to understand that when you start getting into these bigger and bigger projects, and I did log placements and everything, really need to think about where you're going. And do we agree on that? Because if you do not agree on that, you will not get there, because people will make decisions, and things happen quickly that you have to make decisions, and that's the litmus test. Does it get us there? Does it get us there? And if it doesn't, then why are we doing this? And sometimes us in the Western science world go, we can do this. We can move fish, or we can put bulldozer down there, and sometimes the river just kind of doesn't. So thank you so much for your patience.
This time, we're going to take some questions and answers. So if the speakers could all come up, we have 5 chairs for 5 speakers. Hopefully nobody left. And so we had talks on putting your heart into your work from Kellyx, and not being afraid of failure. We had talks from Frankie on developing new TEK and fixing the world. We had some Redband Trout talk, which I really liked. Jonny, that talk, and Desiree's talk on sediment, and I can't wait to see that. And then finally Tommy's talk wrapping it all up. I'm saying that to just stimulate questions from all the talks because some of them were like over an hour. So, have some volunteers with microphones. Can't hear that microphone. We tested it earlier at work, that's why we did like that. Gwen, is your microphone active? Test. No. So, we're going to try to do this without microphones apparently, because we have everybody up here. This is what we do. You're going to try to fix it right now, Eli? So our electronics fell asleep. I didn't. So let's, Gwen, can you just go, let's get a question here, and then we'll just try to shout it out, and we'll get this things fixed. So can I get anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I don't know.
If you say it, I'll repeat it.
A recurring theme of the talk is being goal. So making decisions being goal. We talked about this is release sediment at this point, and we know that there's some risk when you go with it being bold in your partnerships.
Being bold and saying, hey, we failed, but here's what we're going to learn from it. Being bold and saying, hey, the fish are moving in ways we didn't think they would. So I'm just wondering, what are some other ways that you all have really realized that being bold has benefited you in your research, your partnerships, and your work in general that we can learn from?
Okay, just to help people with the first part of the question, it was a recurring theme as being bold, and then you gave a couple of examples about sediment releases of fish, and what are some other ways that being bold can help with this work here? And I'm going to give it to whoever raises their hand here on the panel.
Real quick, we might be bold, but we're not stupid. The sediment modeling was spot on. That in all dam removals, actually it's often wrong because things happen faster than they were modeled. But the bathymetry, our geomorphologists, our geologists, our hydrologists told us that once we got that stuff mobilized, they would more or less move through the system and stay mobilized out to the ocean. So we didn't wing that. There was a lot of information telling us, but that's what gave us the confidence. And every time we do another dam removal, or someone does another dam removal and documents it, we get more information and more confidence in those data. So once you do it, then you got to stay bold. You can't get what we need because things happen. But when people start reporting stranded deer, people get a little tight, but we just stay bold then.
I think one example that we did at Yurok was adding condor aviation and LiDAR work. And for a tribe to get into aviation, to do LiDAR work at the time we were having the discussion, moving away from, I think, what the vast majority of our focus was to ensure housing and economic development, to move completely to a new field with a new mechanism and new technology was really, really scary. And spending money that we didn't have on a whole process that for us was very, very foreign, I think was an extremely bold move to be like, oh, let's try this whole new process. Let's get into this whole new field that we have never done before through a process that we didn't really know what we were doing. And so I think those sort of actions as well, expanding beyond where you feel comfortable and expanding beyond what you think is your safe place to go and add additional skills or additional mechanisms for research, I think turned out to be pretty phenomenal.
I think that I would make a distinction between being bold and being cavalier. And so when I think about taking risk, I think about taking appropriate risk. And one of the questions that I ask myself is, really what is the worst thing that'll happen? Is it likely to happen? And is it worse than the status quo? And I also ask myself and plead with others to ask, are we restricting ourselves because we think someone else is going to say no? So those are some of the things that I think about. And then in terms of relationships, taking risks in relationships, to me looks like being vulnerable. And one of our strongest relationships is with Trout Unlimited. And it started when, Brian, are you around here somewhere? I'm just going to say this in front of these people. It started with a few tequilas. Because I was really scared that Trout Unlimited was doing similar work in our county to what our RCD was going to do. And I thought if we were both doing the same thing, that it was a threat to us. And so I reached out to him and said, this is scary, can we talk about it? And that has turned into a relationship that is absolutely phenomenal, and we really elevate each other. So that's what some of these things look like for me. And I just have to say, it's a good day when you're meeting in a room that looks like a circus tent with a disco ball. That's just making me feel really happy. I think I would just maybe echo what you said about relationships. Like, I don't think we necessarily took any bold actions on the research side, aside from we worked our butts off, but there are definitely times where we stumbled. I in particular have stumbled in relationships and within the Klamath, within these projects, and you just gotta dust yourself off, pick yourself up, and like keep going, keep trying, apologize where you need to, ask questions where you need to, stay curious, because I mean I know that I'm like awkward at moments, and I have to own that, but also that we're all just doing the best that we can. We're trying to do the right thing, and sometimes everybody makes mistakes, and so being bold for me was like, okay, I might have stumbled there. I gotta get up and try again, and that happened over and over again throughout the course of the research, and research in particular that's very cross-cultural, very cross-disciplinary, and just the relationships that you build as a result of that are so satisfying and so rewarding.
Just one small thing to add. I think when I'm thinking about the bold thing that we did in our research, it was trying to tackle the whole year, which doesn't sound that bold, just like, oh well, 4 seasons. But trying to do field work across a large spatial extent every month of the year, it's a lot of work, and I didn't have to do it. I was just hanging out in my office, like going surfing in the morning. But Jordan and Nick, the 2 graduate students I had, Jordan moved down to the Basin, and he was out there sampling every month of the year. And he'd be like, hey, can you approve this purchase for like a winch for my truck? He's like, why do you need it? He's like, oh, we gotta get to the top of this snowy road so we can get to this spot. And he was out there in a dry suit and working in the snow, getting his truck stuck. And so to me, that was really, it wasn't my boldness, but Jordan's boldness was really inspiring.
Let's have another question. Raise your hand. We'll take one from the back of the room next.
Yeah, so I really appreciated that note about how many cogs it takes in the wheel to push this kind of work forward. And this is one of the most extensive wheels and cogs that I've seen in a long time. And so I guess I'm just interested to hear what is your experience with that, building those relationships and working together to create such a successful project on the pivot.
I think one of the takeaways from building and helping be a part of such a vast network of cogs and partnerships is this, it's being very, very comfortable in understanding failing. And I know we've talked about it a bunch, but it goes the same for the relationship building as well, and being open and vulnerable. I think those are really, really important lessons on how we built such a large coalition of people. Is being open and being vulnerable, and I think taking opportunities when you are sitting in front of people that you should hate, people that you should despise, people that you would think are your enemy and maybe have been your enemies, people you may have hated, and being vulnerable, right? Being open and sharing stories that are close and personal, being able to allow yourself to be attacked, allowing yourself in your community to fall under scrutiny, and being humble about it. I think a lot of the work that we did to build the coalitions and the comps to bring people along was a lot of internal work, right? Like, it was a lot of really, really super personal, individual work that had to take place to move people, and not this like massive, bring your whole organization along, which eventually happened, but it was really, really close one-on-one conversations, sometimes with a little tequila, doesn't hurt, but sometimes like having these really personal conversations with people in front of others and understanding where people are coming from, given that we are all like these individual beings here, and making that connection on a really individual, personal level, pulling off our like hats as the tribal rep or the federal rep or the agricultural representative. You need to fight for your like piece of the pie and hold fast to what you think is right. And it just happened over and over again, right? Like over and over and over again. We had to have these really, really sometimes dark conversations. And then sometimes like we had to have these like really fun, like let's go get shit-faced at the bar conversations.
And quite frankly, there's a lot we had to try to guess that we get here right. We didn't know everything. And to admit, when I sit down, that I work with the science partners of the tribes and the state and federal agencies and NGOs, and we'd say, we don't have another study like this. And in this type of interaction Frankie talks about happened, there was the legal crews, there were KRC, there were people at our lab, there were the economists for the secretarial determination. There are thousands of people that did this, and this had never been done before. And it was like Cal said, there are some times when I would tell our staff, I don't know, there's no answer for this. Here are first principles, and that's scary for us to tell someone to proceed with an action that we're not. I can't cite 7 papers and say this is what you're going to get. And so you have to trust and build up that rapport with your colleagues. And the other thing was showing up. It was really important that we had 4 or 5 years of the heavy-duty planning before COVID, and we were able to meet face-to-face. And we were going out to dinner at night, meeting for coffee, and realizing they had a kid playing softball and they're going to have to leave earlier, whatever it was. But when we went to Zoom, we had those relationships already in place. And if we had not, we would have still been standing off looking at what are you trying to take from me? And that was critical to just have that open. And so it was tough sometimes because there's no science to do some of this stuff.
All right, we'll go to the next question. I promised one from the back, so someone way in the back raise their hand. Mezzanine. Okay, I had one up here. Yeah. He'll come to you right now.
Several of you talked about the importance of mentoring the next generation and putting forth work that will be sustained across generations. And there's a lot of people in the room right now in the Watershed Stewards program, especially who are early career and just figuring out how to get started in doing the work that is so necessary to protect the communities, ecosystems, and beings that we love and share this world with. And I was wondering if any of you had either reflections on your own journeys of being mentored to where you got where you are today and the work that you've been able to do, or how you are incorporating mentorship for early career people in your work now, or any advice you might have for the early career folks.
Okay. So we have a question on mentoring. How about Desiree?
Thanks for that question. That is something that is real near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time working with students. I came from a home where education was prioritized because my parents didn't have any. And so for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we engage people in science and practice of doing good things in the world, and how do we keep them there. And for me, what I've learned is that a lot of it involves providing people with opportunities to do things, but a lot of it's about helping them see their identity, their place in this world. And for a lot of students, like, it involves field trips, field work, getting people into these places where they love, that they can identify with, that they can become passionate about, and it's not something that's going to happen like in a classroom. So for me, like, a key theme is getting people into these places and having experience in these places. So I take students, like in my class, we're going whitewater rafting in Kikiseki Canyon at the end of this month. You know, at the new whitewater, we're going to go tour projects. Like, getting people in these places where they connect with the place and with each other and with themselves is so important. But the other part, I think Frankie was getting at, is a lot of it's just this one-on-one. We can't do this sort of mentoring thing in groups. It's like looking each other in the eyes, understanding what's happening in people's lives, and how can we be responsive as mentors to what they need. And it's a lot of work, but it is some of the most rewarding work that I get to do. And I'm super grateful, because students also, like, early career people, they might not have a lot of skills, but they make up a lot of times with motivation and enthusiasm that some of us who have been around a long time maybe lack at times. So I feel like the students I get to work with, I benefit from that so much, in the sense that they give me energy and hope and motivation for the future. But it is a very, not everybody needs the same thing. So thinking about, like, really listening, being curious, responsive to what an individual needs, and then mostly just getting out of the way, giving them these opportunities, and getting out of the way for them to sort of develop their identity. For me, has been, I think, what's been most helpful. How about you, Jonny? You got anything to add?
Well, I wouldn't want to pretend that I'm like the know-all of mentoring, and I'm always humbled by how much I learn every year. But I guess the key thing, my approach, I think, what I kind of believe is that it's really important to put the students' needs first, because we have our own needs, right? We're like, oh, I run a research program, I got to produce papers, I got to finish students. But students might not necessarily, they don't necessarily want to become academics, or they have their own routes, and they want, so supporting your, whatever's, like, putting your own interests second to your students, if the two are competing with each other. And then I think the other one is intuitive, which is just being supportive of your students and being there for them when they're having a hard time. Because it seems like increasingly there's just, we have COVID, now we've got these budget cuts. There's always a new daunting challenge, and just making sure you save some bandwidth to be there for them, the people that are relying on you.
And this is something that's really near and dear to me, and you may have noticed that in my talk I actually didn't call it mentoring. There's something about that sounds very unidirectional and hierarchical to me. And I think for me, it's just about, are we invested in each other's careers and success, period. I'm still getting mentored. There's like 20 of you in this room who are my mentors. And some of the people who are earlier in their careers have done a lot to help me grow my career. So I think it's just about being really invested in each other's success, wherever we are in that journey.
All right, we've got time for probably about 2 more questions, I think. One here.
Tommy and Frankie, you mentioned the need to take time to build trust. And in fact, in some circumstances where there's hundreds of years of distrust. Oh, okay. And yet we're under pressure to move rapidly because we know the fish are going extinct. And so there's this tension, and I feel this in my work, working with landowners, where you're trying to build that trust and go to face to face, and also the time needed to build the science, for instance. So how do you deal with the tension between the need to take the time to build trust and yet to do things at a pace that you think is needed?
Tension between the time taken to build trust and the urgency of the fisheries restoration.
I think that's a phenomenal question, and that tension, in working to build relationships, that's really good. right? It brings a lot of energy to a space, and I think it connects back to the earlier question of what do we do to be bold? And I think the quicker that we can drag people into spaces that are scary, where you have this like collective and shared fear of what's going to happen, the closer you are to coming together, right? So taking these like really big, bold initiatives or moving forward in a really vulnerable space, the quicker that you can bring people into that, where you have this shared fear, makes it much easier to build that trust in one another, right? Much easier to see people as human beings. And I would love to say, it's way easier to do it if everything's really successful and you have a lot of, good partnerships. But I think from my experience, pushing that, being bold, moving forward in actions where you don't know what's going to happen, I find it's much easier to make personal quick connections. And I think the quicker that you show your vulnerability, the quicker that you open up, the easier it goes. The longer that you hold back, the longer that you keep your barrier of your personal life out from your professional life, the longer you wear your hat of who you are in your job position, in your professionality, the harder it will be. And it's really not until you kind of just be like, I am Frankie, and let's have a conversation. The quicker you do that, the easier it is and the faster that you move with actually building those relationships. And I think that's for a lot of the work. But for this work, take your hat off early. Show up as you, whatever that means. Connect with whatever way it connects. And it's much easier to start building it in that way. But what do you think, Jonny?
I would say where we were, if you were disingenuous, you weren't at the table very long. That was obvious. I think it takes time. It takes a lot of time. And like I said earlier, you have to listen and hear. So we tried on the Klamath to bring lots of other groups in. And some days were good, some days were bad. And we did something real interesting with our NIMS group. We had a group of 8 people called the Klamath Vision Group. And we would once a month get together, but also usually once a year get some support. And we'd go up for 5 days by ourselves in the basin. We'd go to the upper basin, the lower basin. We'd go to look at the wildlife refuge and spend time with people that we were interacting with. And from most of the folks there, they were policy buy-off, but that allowed us to interact because our cylinders of excellence often don't talk to each other. And, but also to be sitting in someone's front yard talking to them about the fishing they had that year or the crops they raised that year or what they're doing and seeing them something else than wearing their hat. And that was important, but it takes time and often it's hard to get that time in our busy lives.
I was just going to add, that was a really good question, and I had the same question. It seems like there's often this inherent trade-off between moving fast, but then taking the time to build trust.
Last comment on this, for those who are organizing talking sessions and those who are like moderating these sort of conversations to bring people together, let me make the one comment that when your group is starting to get very, very heated, and starting to have really passionate conversations that seem like a really, really big difference between the parties, don't stop it. And really start to listen. People get very passionate about what they're talking about and get really entrenched into their sides. That's when you should be listening to the hardest about what they're saying, right? Like really dig into that and really understand, what is behind what they're saying. And I think a really good argument and a really good mouth fight in a group of people can be very, very helpful.
I was at a meeting where the tension exploded. And there was a brilliant opportunity to have everybody at the room, because it kind of came up, it wasn't on the agenda. So nobody had got their ducks in a row. And Frankie and some other folks really pushed it. And we couldn't have that conversation. And so not everything in the Klamath went well. We had a few of these meetings where it was heated. And we had an opportunity, and for a lot of reasons it was let go. And I think we could have got a lot farther on a few key issues that we needed to deal with. And it's one of the reasons I enjoy Frankie. He called us all out, and we had an opportunity to do it, and the parties that were there didn't want to have it. And so we didn't do everything right on the Klamath. We fumbled some balls and had some opportunities.
I think that it feels sometimes like collaborating and building trust is slowing things down, but it's actually not. I think that it feels like if we just get to work, that's faster, but it's going to fail. Or it's really not going to, there's going to be so many things that come up along the way that if we slow down to go fast, I think that it's frequently perceived that makes us go slower, but a part of that is because we're not valuing that as part of the work.
I'm not supposed to input on this, but I would say if you have there's different degrees of landowners. Some of them want to do projects, other ones are very skeptical. If you have some easy wins, take them. Other people see those, come along too. That would be my advice. So try to get something done instead of like bogging down and stuff like that. Other than that, really building these relationships is an ongoing process. It's not something you start when you want to build a project. You start it much before you even know what kind of project you want, and then you don't have to start from zero. So I know I'm not supposed to input. It was such an excellent question. Thank you. I think we're at the lunch hour here, so we're going to break. Dana's going to come up and talk about some housekeeping here. So don't get up and start talking yet here, because Dana's going to have some words for us. You guys have been the best audience. I want to thank our speakers here.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. That was a really beautiful plenary session. Thank you so much.